have another myth I'm excited to talk about today, and this one is a doozy. So, when I look around at my unhealthy culture, I notice a lot of big troubles. I notice sexism, I notice political corruption, I notice pollution, and a lot of other troubles too. And I also notice that it's common for activists to come together in groups and try and address these different troubles. And so you'll have a group of feminists trying to address sexism, or a group of social activists trying to fight political corruption, or environmentalists trying to fight pollution. And when I talk with activists or I read their writings, I notice a common underlying belief that I believe is a myth. And the myth is the idea that these are all separate problems, right? The idea that sexism is a different problem from political corruption, which is different from racism, which is a different problem from wars based on lies, or environmental destruction, or child abuse, right? I believe the reality is that these are all actually the same problem, right? They're different facets or different manifestations of the same root problem. And to put it another way, they're actually symptoms of a single root cultural disease. So in this video, I want to talk about how can we know that all these things that might seem so different are all actually the same problem. And I want to talk about ineffective activism. How come so many activists throughout history have put so much effort into addressing things like sexism or corruption and have had so little success? And I don't just want to complain. I want to talk about what is the root problem that that so many people have struggled to address throughout history. And I want to talk about healthy cultures and what can be learned from them to help heal the troubles in unhealthy cultures like the one where I live in the United States. So, let's talk about activism. But before diving in, I want to say this. I have a huge amount of respect for activists, right? They commonly show a huge amount of courage and love, and they take a stand for what's right. And what do they get in return? Well, they commonly get slandered, they get imprisoned, they get killed, they lose their job, right? It's not easy being an activist and really taking a stand. And I have a lot of respect for that. And so in this video, I don't mean to disrespect or belittle activists in any way. That said, I think it's important to acknowledge when an approach to a problem isn't working, so that people can consider different approaches that might work better, right? So, when there are so many big problems, it's easy to think, well, I can't fix everything, so I'm going to focus on something and do my best, and maybe I can make some difference that way. And I notice that it's common, for people to join a movement that addresses a problem maybe that resonates with them or that they're personally affected by. And so women might be more likely to join a movement that focuses on anti-women sexism, or people living near a factory that pollutes might be more likely to focus on that environmental problem. Parents with a kid who has suffered from a vaccine injury might be more likely to focus on vaccine awareness issues, right? And I don't want to diminish the successes that have happened, right? There's been lots of examples of like incremental change throughout history. Like, for example, gasoline used to have lead in it, so it's less toxic now. It used to be more toxic, right? So it's less toxic is better than more. But pollution is a gargantuan and growing problem, and compared to like the scale of that problem, right? Like taking lead out of gasoline is relatively minor. And so it's not that it's nothing, right? It was like, I'm glad that change happened. But compared to the scale of the problem, it's a very minor victory. And those kinds of minor victories don't even happen that often, right? To take another example, labor activists will work really hard to form a labor union, right? Then they'll work really hard even further to fight for a decent wage, or to improve their working hours or the safety on the job. And what happens? Well, even if they succeed, in the best case, a few years later, they're back to having the same fight again, right? Because inflation has happened, or profits have gone up, or whatever. It's time to fight for an actually decent wage again. It's time to, fight for safety again, right? The same fight keeps happening over and over. And it turns out that's just a normal thing. So when I look at like the history of social activism, the reality is that there's never been an environmental movement in the history of humanity that actually ended pollution or environmental destruction in their culture, right? There's never been a feminist movement that actually ended sexism in their culture. There's never been an anti-racism or anti-discrimination movement that actually ended racism or discrimination in their culture, right? This is ridiculous. And I wish I was out of examples, but I'm not, right? There's never been a movement to end child sexual abuse in an unhealthy culture that actually succeeded, right? No matter how many times authorities get caught abusing children and higher level authorities get caught covering it up, it just keeps happening. And plenty of examples from the Catholic Church show this. Also the Tibetan Buddhist monasteries or certain business groups, right? These are just common problems in many unhealthy cultures around the world, and they just keep happening. There has never been a peace movement in the history of humanity that made it so that authorities permanently stopped pushing for wars that serve the rich, right? There's never been a labor movement that ever made it so that government officials and the rich or the aristocrats stopped trying to take advantage of the workers, right? So there've been so many of these movements in so many countries throughout history, and I wonder why are brave, creative, hardworking, self-sacrificing activists who take a stand for what's right consistently struggling to achieve the deep change that they want, right? Well, I believe whatever they've been doing, it hasn't addressed the root problem. So what is the root problem? And to get to that root problem, I want to talk about healthy and unhealthy cultures. So I just published a book. It's a free book called One Disease, One Cure. And in this book, I share my research into healthy and unhealthy cultures. And it turns out that in every culture that I've ever found, if it has racism, then it also has sexism. Every culture with racism and sexism also has political corruption, also has pollution, also has widespread child abuse, right? Also has authorities that push for wars that serve the rich, right? These issues all seem to arise together in unhealthy cultures. And then you have these healthy cultures that don't have these troubles. They don't have racism, they don't have sexism, they don't have political corruption, right? They don't have child abuse. And I noticed these beautiful cultures, and I noticed these unhealthy cultures, and I wondered, how are these people in these beautiful cultures able to maintain this beautiful way of life, essentially indefinitely? And how come these people in these unhealthy cultures seem trapped with these big troubles that seem to never go away, no matter how much people try? And I noticed a single root problem, what I call the root cultural disease in unhealthy cultures. Whenever a few people impose law on everybody else, and whenever a few people can choose how that law is enforced, and everyone else is expected to just go along with it, all those troubles arise, right? And of course, when a few people can impose law and choose how it's enforced, that's just what it means to have rulers, right? So whenever a few people rule over everybody else, then you've got an unhealthy culture. That is the root cultural disease, having rulers. And the sexism and the corruption and the few rich and a lot of poor, right, the pollution, right, those are all symptoms of that root cultural disease in every unhealthy culture I've ever studied. In healthy cultures, they don't have rulers, right? No one's imposing law on anybody else. So they agree on their rules, and anyone can hold anyone else accountable. And so they don't have these symptoms. They don't have the sexism. They don't have the child abuse. They don't have the greed. And I'm not saying they're perfect, right? A problem might arise, right? They might have a leader for a moment whose leadership they don't like, or someone might behave inappropriately, right? But problems might arise, and they're able to address them to bring life back to a baseline of mutual respect, which is the norm, right? And then any issues that arise are sort of deviations from the norm that they can quickly address. So that then is the root problem, right? Having rulers is the root cultural disease. And another way of saying this is that in unhealthy cultures, or some people might call them civilizations, but in unhealthy cultures, another way of putting the defining problem is that people learn to tolerate predators, right? People learn to not hold others in their own culture accountable when they behave inappropriately, right? And so you can continue to have priests abusing children for centuries and it just keeps happening, right? Like people have learned to tolerate predators. You can have political corruption, right, for centuries, and people will still keep voting even though they know the politicians are going to break their promises, right? People have learned to tolerate predators or inappropriate behavior in their own society, right? That's what it means to live in an unhealthy culture. So I'd like to share some stories from some healthy cultures that helped me recognize this perspective. And these stories are what I call transition stories. They're stories from, like in the beginning, the culture lived in a way that maintained that baseline of mutual respect, right? They didn't have all these big troubles um, as a normal way of life, right? The sexism and the greed and the corruption and so on. And then something terrible happened, and then afterwards they had all those troubles. They had the poverty and the corruption and the sexism and so on. And what is that transition that led from like none of those big troubles to all of those big troubles? Well, it was when law was imposed on them, right? Which is what it means to be conquered, right? So they were conquered. And so these stories, like a lot of people might have read or heard about stories of one culture conquering another. But these stories I think, are different than the stories most people have heard. And so I want to give an example of, before I talk about these healthy cultures, as an analogy, I want to mention like Germany and Poland, right? At the beginning of World War II, Germany conquered Poland. So as a Polish person, before the war, you lived under Polish law, right? The Polish rulers imposed the Polish law that the Polish people lived under. After the German invasion, the Germans imposed law, right? So the Polish people might have known, okay, this isn't legitimate, right? I don't want German rulers imposing German law, right? But they were forced to deal with it. But the reality is the Polish people weren't free before the war, right? They didn't choose their own laws. Like the Polish rulers imposed laws on everybody else. And so they're already an unhealthy culture. It was just differently unhealthy when the Germans invaded. And so that's not what I'm talking about here. With these cultures that I'm going to describe, they didn't have anyone imposing law ahead of time. And so it was a much different transition for them. So and then these transition stories, again, what they show me is that the sexism, the corruption, the poverty, the greed, right? These things arise together. They arise after that transition to an unhealthy culture where a few people rule over everybody else. And one last preface I want to say is that these are very sensitive stories, right? Because they involve a huge amount of abuse, and it hasn't been remediated or really acknowledged to this day. And so I think still it's important to share the stories, because these stories show the truth of what it's like to live in an unhealthy culture, and can help people like me in unhealthy cultures recognize the trap that we're in and what can be done about it. So the first story I want to share comes from the Nootka, and they live in Western North America. And their first encounter with an unhealthy culture was with the Spanish conquistadors, right? So a boat of Spanish sailors and arrived some centuries ago. And interestingly, their first observation, or like one of their first observations, was actually the Catholic priest behaving very inappropriately with a little Catholic boy that he brought with him from Europe. This didn't seem like a big focus in this particular story this Nootka storyteller was sharing, but it was like one of those little nuggets, right? Like a little insight that shows, oh yeah, these problems have lasted for centuries, right? Authorities abusing children and everyone else in the culture just sort of tolerating that as a normal way of life. And so in contrast, the Nootka had never actually encountered child sexual abuse before. And when the Spanish and the Nootka met, right, when the Spanish arrived on the coast, for a while they had, to sum up a long story very short, not great interactions, right? But it wasn't bad enough yet for the Nootka to drive out the Spanish until this happened. So the Spanish kidnapped two 10-year-old Nootka girls, raped them, killed them, and then left their bodies on the beach for the relatives to find the next day, right? And the Nootka found them, and this Nootka storyteller in this book called Daughters of Copper Woman describes the Nootka's response to this this really gruesome crime. And I want to quote what she said, because what she said really expressed the message I want to get across in this video. This is how this Nootka storyteller described their response to this act. She said the people had no way of understanding what had happened. They'd never been anything like this in all the time since the beginning of life, and so they could only stare at the proof of horror and feel numb shock. They could see what had been done, but they couldn't understand how or why. And this blew me away when I first read it, because it showed me that they had never even imagined that child sexual abuse was a thing, right? It literally had not happened in their history, right? And it showed that this kind of problem isn't inevitable, right? The reality, of course, is that child sexual abuse had happened many times throughout history, but never in their experience, right? Because it had only happened in unhealthy cultures in other parts of the world, like many of the cultures in Europe at the time. But when the Europeans brought that kind of behavior to the Nootka, all of a sudden they encountered it and they realized it was a possibility, right? Now, the Nootka storyteller also said this. She said it was, so a little context. This storyteller is describing a Nootka woman who was inspecting the bodies of the two girls. And she said this: "It was as if the sure evidence of what she found shook the center post of all creation and threatened the here and now, as well as the past and future." And when I read this the first time, it took me a moment to figure out what that meant. But I believe in every healthy culture I've ever found, they maintain a baseline of mutual respect as a norm, right? And so any disrespect is it's like a deviation. And the question is, if we allow disrespect, where does it end, right? Once we allow disrespect, well, it could just keep happening, and it could even snowball and get really bad, right? And so I believe every healthy culture addresses every act of disrespect fully to bring them back to that way of life where mutual respect is the norm. And so I believe what this Nootka storyteller was saying was that this is a profound disrespect, and if we allow this, then it threatens everything. It threatens our entire way of life. And so they didn't tolerate it. Actually, they joined forces with some other nearby communities, and they attacked the Spanish and actually killed every single one of them on that boat. So they did take that stand for a culture of mutual respect. Unfortunately, more Spanish conquistadors came later, and they kept fighting, and ultimately the Spanish were able to impose law on the Nootka. And the Spanish, however, had a trouble, right? They wanted to conquer the Nootka. However, the adults knew what it was like to live in a culture of mutual respect. They knew what it was like to take a stand, to live with dignity, right? And not let others boss them around. And so what they wanted was for the conquered people to accept having rulers as legitimate, right? Or to accept predators as legitimate. So what did they do? Well, they did something that many conquering people have done throughout history. They kidnapped their children and they sent them to abusive boarding schools. And so these were Catholic boarding schools, and I won't go into a lot of detail about what they were like in this video, but there's a huge amount of shaming of the children, a lot of physical abuse, a lot of sexual abuse. And what really blew me away reading these stories was that the Nootka women watched their children be taken away. And then years later, they watched what happened when those same children came back, right now as young adults. And what they described was this: domestic abuse, husbands beating wives, mothers beating children, drunkenness, sexism, right? Men looking down on women as objects or only people there to serve men, prostitution, girls believing they were bad or dirty, especially in relation to their menstrual cycle. And none of these things had existed prior to the Spanish kidnapping the children and raising them in an abusive way. So these problems didn't exist before, right? The sexism, the poverty, the drunkenness, the domestic violence, right? They didn't exist before, but within a generation, they did. And especially when that generation included growing up with child abuse. So unfortunately, the Nuka aren't the only examples of this. I found many examples in my research of this tragic pattern, but I want to give one more. And it comes from the Tsutihil Mayans. Now, they lived in a more or less traditional way until about 1990. And I talk about them in some of these other videos, and I give a lot of stories from them in my book. But one key thing here is that they maintained a gift economy, right? They maintained a way of life that rewarded sharing, that rewarded generosity, and they would lift up people as leaders who were the most generous and were actually expected to give away everything they had to get to the topmost levels of leadership. And Martin Prechtel got to live with them for, I think, about 10 years throughout the 1980s. And he describes how they were, in about 1990, overrun. They were conquered by the Guatemalans with American backing, and essentially were unable to maintain their traditional way of life anymore. And I want to read what he said, because it really, again, describes this transition from a healthy culture to an unhealthy culture that I'm discussing in this video. He said, so again, they had that essentially traditional way of life until about 1990. And he says, by 1995 in Santiago, there were paved streets, cars, TVs, satellite dishes, thugs, gangs, rape, murder, guns, drug addiction, and overpopulation. He also says this, of course, on account of all that, every house now sported what there wasn't even a word for in the language, a door. Many people even had locking steel doors, right? This, when I first read that hit me like a sledgehammer, right? To live in a culture that maintains such a respectful way of life that they don't even need locks or doors, right? That shared as a normal way of life. There weren't thieves. There weren't poor people just trying to survive. There weren't rich people trying to take advantage of everybody else, right? So they didn't need that security from their own neighbors, right? And so they didn't even have a word for door in their language, right? But within a few years, and after a huge amount of violence, they did need those things. And it's not that every single person, right, who grew up in a traditional way started behaving inappropriately. Like, I believe a lot of the Nuka and Tsutihil Mayans, like, they did their best to maintain living in as good a way as they could, just through this terrible trouble. But what I believe is that they recognized that these things, right, doors with locks, gangs, corruption, poverty, sexism, they recognized those as a catastrophe, right, as a total disaster, as not okay, right, because to them it wasn't a normal way of life, right? They knew what it was like to live in a beautiful way with a culture of mutual respect, whereas for someone like me, it's just normal, right? Sexism seems pervasive in the United States where I live, right? But also, I believe, in every unhealthy culture around the world. Child abuse just seems to be a problem that most people try not to talk about, but it doesn't seem to go away. Corruption, poverty, right? Sexism. They're just normal problems. So to me, they don't seem like a catastrophe because they seem normal. But to people who know what a healthy culture is like, these issues do seem, I believe, like a catastrophe because they know better. So, what's the big takeaway for me? These are sudden big changes, is one, right? If before the conquering, before imposing law, you had people who didn't have sexism, they didn't have greed, they didn't have corruption, they didn't have widespread child abuse. Afterwards, these were problems they experienced, right? And especially after a generation was raised in an abusive way. And what that shows me, right, is that these are actually not different problems, right? The drunkenness, the domestic abuse, the sexism, the corruption, the poverty, these are, like, if they were different problems, they would show up at different times, right? You'd have political corruption showing up, and then, like, 50 years later, sexism would show up, and then 50 years later, pollution would happen, right? But what I commonly notice is that these problems all arise together, right? And they arise at that moment where a few people impose law on everybody else. And another thing that this shows me is how easy it is to normalize inappropriate behavior, right? If a person grows up with it. And so, what's it mean to tolerate inappropriate behavior? Well, how many people like just sort of expect that their boss is going to try and keep their wages as low as possible, right? How many people just sort of accept that school is basically uninteresting, but you just sort of have to do it? How many people just accept that politicians are corrupt, or a lot of them, and they're just going to break their promises? And I might vote or I might not, but like that's just how it is, right? Well, no, that's not just how it is, right? That's how it is in an unhealthy culture. But it's easy to, especially when children are raised in a disrespectful way, to accept disrespect as a normal way of life. And that, I believe, is why so many colonists actually force children of healthy cultures to go to these disrespectful boarding schools, is it raises children in a disrespectful way so that as adults, they'll accept disrespect as a normal way of life, which is just what it means to live in an unhealthy culture. So, the reality is that humans didn't evolve for this. We didn't evolve for sexism. We didn't evolve for political corruption or greed, or these other troubles. The reality is that those of us trapped in unhealthy cultures are stuck in massive, multi-generational abusive relationships, right? Troubles might arise in healthy cultures, but again, they're able to address them, to bring them back to that baseline of mutual respect, whereas in unhealthy cultures, the abuse just keeps happening. My dream is for the feminists to join forces with the activists fighting racism, and for them to join forces with the activists fighting environmental destruction, join forces with the activists fighting to prevent wars that serve the rich, right? For all these activists to not just fight the separate symptoms, but to come together and to fight the root problem, right? Because any doctor will tell you, so long as you're only fighting a symptom, you're never actually going to heal the root disease, and those symptoms will just keep happening, right? But if everyone could come together and create a culture of mutual respect, those symptoms could go away. And I want to end on a positive note for this video, which is that in my book, One Disease, One Cure, I give a huge number of examples and stories of healthy cultures. How do they maintain leaders that serve the people? How do they maintain a gift economy that rewards sharing? How do they deal with problems when they arise, when someone does behave inappropriately? And one of the case studies that I offer is of the Zapatistas, right? They had been conquered for many centuries, about 500 years, and under the Spanish and later the Mexicans in southern North America. And in 1994, they actually they took a stand, right? They set their own laws, and they all agreed essentially to protect each other if the Mexicans tried to impose their law again. And they were able to create a healthy culture. And just to give one example of the kind of profound change that can happen, 20 years later, a woman went and traveled to the Zapatistas and actually interviewed a bunch of Zapatista women who described the terrible sexism they had faced before the revolution, and they described dramatic reduction in the sexism afterwards, right? A huge amount, like far less sexual assault, not quite zero still, but like way less. Women having all kinds of positions of influence and leadership positions, equal pay, right? Like actually massive improvements in a way that just doesn't seem to happen in unhealthy cultures, right? And that's only one example. Many other examples, getting rid of a few rich and a lot of poor, right? They actually address that as well. So it's possible, right? When people learn to address the root problem, it's possible to have deep change. But it takes addressing the root problem and not just fighting the different symptoms. And so that ultimately is what my book is about. One disease, one cure. What would it be like to get to the root of the problem and stop having all these big troubles that seem to never go away? The sexism and the greed and the corruption and so on. And so if this is something you're interested in, I welcome you to get your own copy now for free. It's called One Disease, One Cure, and it's available at onedisease-onecure.com.